Tonight is December 19th, 2025. The moon is new and close to Earth, a perigee new moon that hides its face and leaves the sky unusually clean. If you step outside and let your eyes adjust, you may feel the darkness behaving like a lens, sharpening every bright point and deepening every gap. In that black, something else seems to sharpen too. Reports coming in from observatories in Chile describe a thin, sunward feature on the interstellar object 3I Atlas. Not a soft fan trailing away, but a narrow spike that for the first time in millions of years appears to point directly at Earth. For a moment, it feels like a face-to-face meeting. We can call it the encounter. That sentence alone can make the dark feel personal, but the file keeps adding pages. The coma around 3I Atlas is described as carrying an emerald tint that astronomers often associate with diatomic carbon, C2, familiar chemistry wearing an unfamiliar mood. Some summaries also claim an odd spectral balance, unusually high nickel and unusually low iron, the kind of ratio that tempts the imagination toward heat-tolerant alloys instead of primitive rock. And then there is rhythm. A circulating analysis attributed to a Russian observing campaign suggests a repeating 4-hour positional shift and a quieter 2-hour pulse in brightness. It even hints at an uneasy coincidence with the timing of our own geostationary satellite cycle, like a handshake that might be accidental. Tonight, we treat those lines the way a careful investigator treats any late arriving testimony. We listen, we compare, we keep our voice low. This is a space documentary built for sleep, and calm is not denial. Calm is the discipline that lets you hold several possibilities at once. First, we test the plain physics, the kind that explains why an innocent object can look like it is aiming at us. Then, only after the simple answers are laid out, we let the darker questions enter gently, like a shadow crossing a wall. If you enjoy stories that balance science with that slow edge of unease, you can support the channel in a practical way. Subscribe for long, quiet investigations into space mysteries, and if the sky is clear where you are, share what you noticed tonight. If you have a grounded explanation, write it in simple words so others can follow. If you have a more speculative theory, keep it calm and specific, and tell us what observation led you there. And if you are only here to rest, tell us what kind of mysteries you want next, from comet physics to odd signals to the quiet ways our planet interacts with passing objects. Take a breath that is a little slower than the last one. Let your shoulders loosen. Imagine the night outside, wide and patient, and imagine your thoughts drifting like dust in low gravity, settling into quiet. Now, dim the lights. In the first section of our file, we begin with geometry, because geometry decides what a human eye can mistake for meaning. In deep space, a simple alignment can look like a message. A thin sheet can collapse into a line. A harmless trail can become a pointer. Avi Loeb has spoken about the geometry of observation, the way perspective can manufacture intention out of ordinary dust. Tonight, that geometry is the stage. Earth is not only watching 3I Atlas. Earth is moving into the precise position that makes a certain kind of tail appear to turn and look back. To understand the anti-tail, you have to think like a particle. Comet-like objects release dust, and dust does not vanish. It drifts, it spreads, and it can linger along the orbit as a faint ribbon, a trail that follows the path like a memory. Most nights, We see that ribbon at an angle, and it looks like a soft smear, or it disappears into the background. But on rare nights, when an observer crosses the object's orbital plane, the view changes. We look through the ribbon edge on. The dust that was once spread across space is packed into a thin, apparent width, and the feature can suddenly look sharp, bright, and strangely disciplined. This is the classic geometry behind an anti-tail. That is why December 19th feels so carefully chosen, even if it is only coincidence. A plane crossing is a geometrical event, and it creates an illusion that feels directed, as if the universe has aimed a finger at you. Add the new moon, and the scene grows sharper. Without lunar glare, the contrast increases. The mind becomes more willing to believe in a target when the sky is quiet, when darkness is complete, and when a narrow line seems to hold its shape with unnatural certainty. There is a simple way to picture it. Imagine standing on a long road at night, looking toward a distant streetlight. The road edges seem to converge into a single point, sharp and almost aggressive, even though the asphalt is flat and harmless. Perspective turns parallel lines into a spearhead. In space, dust trajectories and orbital planes can play the same trick. The anti-tail can look rigid because the depth is hidden, and it can look bright because more dust is stacked into the same thin line of sight. The sensation of being aimed at can be nothing more than the mathematics of looking through a plane. If we stop here, the mystery becomes soothing. The universe has not singled you out. The sky is performing a geometric illusion, and you are witnessing the moment when the illusion bow is at its strongest. But the summary guiding this story insists there is a second layer. It suggests the anti-tail of 3i Atlas is not only narrow, but too narrow, too bright, too clean. A natural dust sheet should have texture, a gentle spread, a softness at the edges. If the feature holds together like a controlled beam, then geometry may be wearing a mask, and the underlying mechanism may be something else. So we allow one careful imaginative leap, not as a claim, but as a controlled thought experiment. Suppose the anti-tail is a corridor of guided material, a line maintained by a field, and suppose 3i Atlas prefers to reveal it on a night like this, when the moon is absent and our attention is least distracted. In that version of the story, the line that seems to point at Earth is not a weapon. It is a measurement, a quiet scan aligned along the orbital plane for maximum signal, using nature's own geometry as camouflage. If that sounds like a conspiracy lullaby, remember that it is also how good deception works in physics. You hide your strongest action inside the observer's expected illusion. Then we step back onto firmer ground. Anti-tails are real phenomena, and they have startled observers before. Dust can form thin structures, and perspective can make them look impossibly sharp. Tonight's anchors remain what they are: the date, the new moon near perigee, the plane crossing that can create an anti-tail illusion, and the reported green Siahu glow, the whispers of nickel-rich, iron-poor chemistry, and the rumored cadence of 4 hours and 2 will need patient testing. For now, we let the geometry settle into place, and we carry one gentle question into the next chapter. Soon, the solar wind, shaped into the Parker spiral that Eugene Parker described, begins to complicate the view, and the quiet sky may develop a blind spot at the worst possible time. If this is only a trick of perspective, why does it arrive with so many other synchronized details, as if the universe timed the encounter on purpose? The first time you notice it, It does not feel like dust. It feels like a decision, a narrow, pale line drawn with too much confidence across a dark sky, as if 3-Eye Atlas has learned how to point. In the calm version of this story, we already have our main key. Tonight, December 19th, 2025, Earth is crossing the orbital plane of 3-Eye Atlas. That single geometric fact can turn a wide, faint dust sheet into a sharp, apparent spike. The new moon deepens the contrast, and the darkness does the rest. A dust trail, seen edge on, collapses into a line. A line feels like a signal, especially when it seems to aim toward the observer. But the file does not stop at geometry. It adds adjectives that refuse to lie down. Too bright, too narrow, too coherent. An ordinary dust trail should have softness at its edges and a gradual spread, because dust grains do not march in perfect formation. Radiation pressure from sunlight separates grain sizes. The smallest grains are pushed harder, and the larger grains drift more gently, lingering closer to the orbital path like slow memory. Even when the geometry is perfect, the physics usually leaves fingerprints, a smear, a taper, a subtle fuzz. So the first grounded question is a technical one. Could a natural dust anti-tail become needle thin without help? Sometimes, yes. There is a known trick called forward scattering. When the angle between the sun, the object, and the observer is just right, dust can brighten dramatically because it preferentially scatters light in the forward direction. In those moments, what was always there can suddenly look like it ignited. If tonight's alignment places Earth at a favorable phase angle, the brightness can surge without any new activity at all. The spike can appear clean simply because the brightest dust is stacked along one thin sightline, and your eyes and the camera sensors are being fed the same narrow beam of reflected sunlight. That explanation is comforting because it requires no agency. It is mathematics and optics. It turns the anti-tail into a coincidence you can understand, even as your skin still remembers the feeling of being watched. And yet, the summary we are drawing from insists that the spike looks unusually disciplined, not only bright, but tightly bounded, as if it has walls. That is where Avi Loeb's style of questioning enters, not as an answer, but as a method. When an observation seems to exceed what random nature tends to produce, you do not leap to aliens. You ask what mechanism could keep a structure coherent under stress. The stress tonight is not subtle. Any outflow from 3-Eye Atlas, whether gas or dust, is swimming in a wind. Solar photons push on dust grains. The solar wind pushes on ionized gas, carving plasma structures and shaping tails that point away from the sun. Anti-tails are not supposed to behave like ion tails. They are dust features tied to the orbital plane, and they often look sunward simply because of projection. But if the spike remains narrow even as conditions change, then the question becomes less about what we see and more about what is holding it. This is where the story darkens, gently, without raising its voice. Imagine the anti-tail not as a random sheet, but as a filament. If a filament remains tight, something must be resisting dispersion. In ordinary comet physics, a strong, organized magnetic field is not expected from a small body. Dust itself does not care about magnetic fields unless it becomes charged, and even then, the behavior depends on grain size and plasma environment. Still, the summary hints at Emerald C2 glow around 3-Eye Atlas, a sign of gas chemistry that can be excited by sunlight. Gas can ionize, dust can charge, and charged material can, in principle, be guided. One grounded speculation is that we are seeing a hybrid structure, a dust trail sharpened by plane crossing, plus a plasma environment that tightens the visible edges, plus forward scattering that turns the whole thing bright. That combination could make a natural feature look engineered. It would also explain why the spike seems to snap into focus tonight, as if it has turned, when in reality the observer has moved into the correct slice of space to make the structure obvious. And then we allow the second speculation, the one the file keeps returning to. If 3i Atlas carries its own magnetic architecture, even a modest one, it could shape its near environment the way a magnetosphere shapes the flow of charged particles around a planet. It would not need to be enormous. It would only need to be organized. In that scenario, the anti-tail is not merely dust you happen to look through. It is a constrained corridor where charged grains and plasma are shepherded into a tighter beam than nature usually grants. The beam would still borrow its brightness from the sun, still hide behind geometry, still pretend to be a coincidence. But inside the coincidence, something would be choosing the shape. This is where the rumored chemistry becomes more than trivia. High nickel and low iron, if it holds up under scrutiny, is an odd balance to emphasize in a story about heat and stress. Nickel-rich alloys are prized in human engineering for high-temperature performance and corrosion resistance. That is not proof of anything. Nature can produce odd compositions, and spectra can be tricky. But when you place that rumor beside a spike that seems too coherent, your mind begins to connect points the way constellations are born, by drawing lines that might not exist. And then there is rhythm, the quiet heartbeat in the margins. A 4-hour positional shift, a 2-hour brightness pulse. Those numbers might eventually dissolve into ordinary rotational modulation, jets turning on and off as a lumpy object spins. They might be artifacts of sampling, weather, and instrument cadence. But tonight, with the anti-tail aligned toward Earth, the file suggests a more unsettling interpretation. That the pulses are not random, that they are timed, that 3i Atlas is not only reflecting light, but modulating what it reflects in a way that could be read if you were close enough or patient enough or built to listen. Here is the imaginative leap, kept brief and controlled, like a candle in a sealed room. Suppose the spike is a probe of the viewing geometry. Suppose it is a narrow corridor of material, guided by a field, and suppose the pulsing is deliberate, a simple on-off pattern designed to test a response. Not a message in language, but a handshake in physics. Do you notice the cadence? Do you react? Do your instruments adjust? Do your satellites blink? In that version of the story, the anti-tail pointing at Earth is not a threat. It is a survey, a glance that lasts long enough to measure what kind of world is doing the looking back. We are still anchored to what can be said calmly. Anti-tails exist. Orbital plane crossings make them appear. Forward scattering can exaggerate brightness. C2 emissions can tint a coma green. Everything else, from nickel-heavy spectra to rhythmic pulses, lives in the zone of claims that require careful verification. But in a conspiracy lullaby, the power comes from the overlap between the verified and the ambiguous. The overlap is where a harmless phenomenon can be used as cover for a purposeful act, because the purposeful act can be denied as an illusion. So we end this chapter with the question that keeps the spine awake, even as the voice stays soft. If tonight's spike is only geometry, why does it feel so precise? And why do the most troubling details, coherence, chemistry, cadence arrive together on the one night the sky is darkest. In a quiet room, repetition can become a presence, a faucet that drips at the same interval, a clock that insists on being heard. Tonight, as the anti-tail of 3i Atlas seems to draw a thin line toward Earth, the file adds a different kind of repetition. Not a sound, but a cadence. The detail arrives with the same restrained phrasing as the rest of the night's notes. A Russian observing effort, described in circulating summaries, is said to have found a roughly 4-hour pattern in the object's apparent position, along with a softer brightness pulse near 2 hours. Numbers like that can feel intimate, like something breathing. They can also be ordinary, the natural signature of rotation, or even the shadow of how the data were collected. Still, when a spike seems to point at you, a rhythm can feel like intention. We begin with the plainest explanation, because it is usually where truth hides. Small bodies brighten and dim as they rotate, showing different cross-sections and different textures to the sun and to the observer. If 3i Atlas is irregular, a dark shard with uneven reflectivity and uneven outgassing, it can present a repeating photometric pattern. 2 hours might be a half cycle, 4 hours might be a full cycle, or the blend of two competing periodicities that line up and drift apart like slow waves. There is also the quieter problem of sampling. Telescopes rarely stare without interruption. Weather breaks a night into pieces. Scheduling forces gaps. Ground-based observatories hand off as Earth turns. When you stitch intermittent measurements into a curve, you can manufacture a false periodicity, especially if the object is faint, the errors are large, or the observing windows repeat. A 2-hour pulse can be an echo of cadence rather than physics, and a 4-hour shift can be the byproduct of fitting noisy points to a moving target. Even if the periodicity is real, nature still offers several routes. The environment around a comet-like body is not a fixed sculpture. It is a mixture of dust and gas that responds to light and to plasma. Solar photons push on dust grains. The solar wind shapes ionized material. If diatomic carbon, C2, is contributing to the emerald tint reported in the coma of 3i Atlas tonight, that emission can change as illumination geometry and plasma conditions shift. A faint pulsing could be the sky's weather, not the object's will. So why does the file linger on those numbers? Because they coincide with the same night the anti-tail illusion reaches maximum force. Tonight is December 19th, 2025. Earth is crossing the orbital plane of 3i Atlas, and the moon is new, close to Earth, leaving the sky without lunar glare. Geometry makes a dust trail collapse into a narrow, apparent spike. Darkness makes the spike feel sharper, and a repeating rhythm arriving at the same time makes the whole scene feel less like an accident. The coincidence is sometimes described clumsily, as if geostationary satellites themselves follow a 4-hour orbit. They do not. Their orbit is about a day, but our space infrastructure is full of rhythms that are not orbital periods, monitoring cycles, tracking passes, handovers, routine checks, and operational patterns that cluster into repeating blocks. A 4-hour beat brushing up against human routines can happen by chance, and it is easy to mistake coincidence for connection. The file asks a more unsettling question anyway. What if the overlap is the point? Here is a grounded speculation that stays close to physics. If the anti-tail is mainly dust seen edge on, its turning tonight is primarily perspective. But if 3i Atlas is also releasing charged particles in bursts, those bursts could momentarily sharpen the spike's visibility by changing local scattering conditions, or by altering how dust grains charge and clump within the plasma flow. In that picture, geometry provides the stage, and plasma provides the lighting cues. A 2-hour pulse becomes a natural modulation, the way a storm's intensity can rise and fall without anyone steering it. Now we allow a single imaginative leap, brief and contained, like a thought you can set down again. Suppose the pulsing is not only environmental. Suppose the 4-hour shift reflects small, repeated changes in orientation, deliberate attitude adjustments that change how sunlight is reflected. Avi Loeb's broader habit with anomalies is to ask whether some behaviors could, in principle, be consistent with control without claiming that they are. A controlled reflector, even a simple one, could look like a natural object that just happens to pulse, especially if it hides inside a well-known illusion like an anti-tail. In that scenario, the anti-tail pointing toward Earth tonight is not a weapon. It is a line of sight used for testing. You hide the test inside the observer's expected illusion because everyone will call the spike a projection caused by the orbital plane crossing. You choose a new moon for better contrast. You modulate brightness slowly because slow rhythms survive noise and invite recognition. The digital handshake becomes less about sending language and more about asking a technical question in light. Do you notice the pattern, and do you respond? This is why the thriller does not need impact to feel dangerous. It only needs timing. If the 4-hour beat is real, and if the 2-hour pulse persists across multiple independent observers, then the question shifts from what we see to what is being done. Are we watching an object whose rotation happens to be neat, or are we watching an object using a neat rhythm because neat rhythms are easy to detect? For now, we hold the anchors and keep our conclusions soft. Tonight is December 19th, 2025. Earth is crossing the orbital plane, making an anti-tail possible by geometry alone. Reports describe an emerald CE2 glow around 3i Atlas. Circulating summaries mention a 4-hour positional rhythm and a 2-hour brightness pulse. That is enough to justify attention and not enough to justify certainty. In the next section, the sun stops being background and becomes an active player. Eugene Parker's spiral wind wraps the solar system in moving plasma, and when a coronal hole opens, the wind can accelerate and the noise can rise. If there is a window when Earth's tracking might blink, it is during solar interference. And if 3i Atlas wanted a blind spot, the sun itself is the most believable curtain in space. Tonight, the story widens beyond the thin spike in the sky and turns toward the star that shapes every tail, every glow, and every illusion. Up close, the sun is not a calm lamp. It is a restless surface that tears, heals, and tears again. And on December 19th, 2025, while 3i Atlas seems to point an anti-tail toward Earth in the dark of a new moon, a different feature draws its own line across the solar disk, a dark scar that opens and holds. A coronal hole is not a hole in the ordinary sense. It is a region where the sun's outer atmosphere is cooler and less dense, and where magnetic field lines open outward instead of looping back down. Along those open lines, the solar wind can escape more freely, turning from a slow breath into a faster stream. When a coronal hole rotates into the right position, observers on Earth often feel the consequences days later as a high-speed wind that perturbs Earth's magnetic field and stirs auroras into motion. The unsettling part is not that coronal holes exist. The unsettling part is timing, because timing always feels like intent. In the thriller framing of this file, the sun opens a scar just as 3I Atlas becomes most visually dramatic, right as Earth crosses the orbital plane and the anti-tail illusion reaches its sharpest edge. A rational mind keeps these clocks separate. Solar magnetism does not schedule itself around a passing interstellar object. Still, the human mind is trained to notice synchronization even when it is coincidence, especially when the sky is perfectly dark and the rumor of a pointed line feels personal. To keep our footing, we borrow Eugene Parker's gift to modern physics. The solar wind is not a static breeze, but a continuous outflow that fills the solar system, twisting as the sun rotates. That twist creates the Parker spiral, a vast curved pattern, like a rotating sprinkler painting plasma through space. In that environment, little remains purely straight for long. Dust grains can charge, ions stream, magnetic fields drape and reconnect. Any body moving through the Parker spiral is moving through a sea of fields that can change from hour to hour, even when everything looks still through a telescope. If you could see the spiral the way a spacecraft senses it, it would feel less like empty space and more like weather. Long arcs of magnetism, thin as thought, curling outward, patches of higher density sliding past like invisible surf, and within that surf, the signature of the sun's rotation, insisting that any straight line in the sky is really a line drawn through motion. A fast solar wind stream is not a single gust. It is a river with boundaries, and those boundaries become turbulent, where fast wind catches slow wind. At rounded speeds of several hundred miles per second, such plasma can cross the sun to Earth distance in roughly 2 to 3 days, depending on conditions. When it arrives, satellites often register changes first. Then the upper atmosphere responds. Then the magnetosphere shifts like a sleeping animal that has been nudged and refuses to stay perfectly still. Now place 3I Atlas into that picture, not as a symbol, but as an object with surfaces, dust, and gas. In a purely natural reading, a high-speed stream passing through the same volume of space as 3I Atlas is simply one more coincidence among many. Space is large and streams are wide. Yet the summary guiding this video invites a darker posture. What if the solar wind is not merely background, but interference, a pressure field that complicates observation at the exact moment the anti-tail is most provocative? Here is the first grounded speculation, and it stays close to known behavior. If 3I Atlas is releasing dust and gas, the changing solar wind can change how that material looks. It can alter how easily gas becomes ionized. It can change how dust grains charge, which affects how they respond to electromagnetic forces in the surrounding plasma. If the coma's emerald pit is indeed linked to diatomic carbon, C2, then variations in solar illumination and plasma conditions can shift brightness in ways that resemble pulses, without any deliberate signaling at all. But the file does not want space weather to be only weather. It wants it to be a curtain. A coronal hole, by its nature, is a producer of turbulence, and turbulence is the oldest hiding place in the universe. When the solar wind strengthens, radio propagation can change in the upper atmosphere. The noise floor rises, small tracking disagreements grow. Observers with different instruments produce slightly different stories. None of this guarantees a blind spot, but it creates a familiar condition. The same hours become hard to measure with clean agreement. So we add a second grounded speculation, a shade more unsettling, but still anchored in physics. If 3i Atlas carries any organized magnetic architecture, even modest, it could interact with the solar wind in a way that produces a boundary, a sheath of compressed plasma. Planets do this. Some comets show induced magnetospheres as their outflows meet the solar wind. In such a sheath, emissions can brighten, edges can sharpen, and structures can look unnaturally clean. A fast solar wind stream would intensify that interaction, making a natural object look briefly engineered. At this point, the calm voice has done its duty. It has offered ways nature can produce sharpness, brightness, and confusion without agency. Now, just once, we let the imagination step forward, brief and controlled. Imagine the coronal hole stream as a timed forcing function, not chosen by the sun, but exploited by what passes through it. Imagine 3i Atlas as something that has traveled for ages in silence, waking only when its sensors detect a planet with a strong magnetosphere and a thin, breathing atmosphere, and then using the sun's own turbulence as the perfect moment to test what can be seen and what can be hidden. If that thought feels too sharp, set it down gently. We are not claiming the sun intends anything, and we are not claiming 3i Atlas is engineered. We are describing why this night feels charged in the mind. When nature grows loud, our certainty grows soft. And softness is where suspicion grows, because gaps invite stories, and stories often arrive before measurements do. In the next chapter, we move from the sun's scar to the object's glow. If 3i Atlas truly brightens an emerald sea while the Parker spiral presses plasma against it, what kind of body shines like that under stress, and what kind of body stays intact as the wind rises? The sun does not touch things with hands. It touches them with fields. Tonight, those fields are in motion, and 3i Atlas is moving through them as if through a river that has decided to speed up. In the simplest story, this changes the scenery. In the darker story, it changes the rules. A coronal hole can send fast solar wind outward along open magnetic lines, and the Parker spiral carries that flow across the solar system in a broad, curving sweep. When the wind strengthens, small bodies do what small bodies usually do. Dust spreads, ion tails lengthen away from the sun, the edges soften, structures become more chaotic. That is the expected direction of things, toward dispersion, toward blur. Yet the summary we are working from insists on the opposite impression. It says that instead of being shredded, 3i Atlas appears to brighten, holding an emerald glow associated with diatomic carbon, C2, as though the environment is feeding it energy. It suggests a scene that feels almost nautical, plasma flowing, the object cutting through it, a visible sheath forming as if a bow wave in an invisible sea. The language used is sharp, but the implication is sharper. If the solar wind is a storm, why does 3i Atlas look like it has a shield? Here, hard science can still carry most of the weight. Small bodies interacting with the solar wind can develop plasma structures without any internal engine. Comets provide the classic example. Sunlight heats their surface, gases sublimate, and those gases become ionized. The solar wind picks up the ions and shapes them into a tail, while the interaction region can form a compressed sheath. Even without an intrinsic magnetic field, the outflow can create an induced magnetosphere, a kind of temporary bubble carved out by the solar wind's own pressure. So, one grounded explanation is that 3I Atlas, despite being interstellar, is behaving comet like enough to produce an interaction region that brightens when the wind strengthens. If the coma contains molecules that fluoresce under solar ultraviolet radiation, the brightness can rise as excitation increases. If the geometry is favorable, forward scattering can also amplify the apparent intensity. In this reading, the shield is simply the normal physics of a body immersed in plasma, painted in brighter strokes, because tonight is both dark for the observer and active for the sun. But the summary leans into a different kind of plausibility anchor. It invokes Mars mission context, like Maven, as a way of reminding us what magnetism can do. Maven has studied how the solar wind strips and reshapes the Martian atmosphere, in part because Mars lacks a global magnetic field and therefore cannot deflect the wind the way the Earth does. The contrast is the point. A world with a strong magnetosphere can bend plasma flow, creating boundaries and auroral signatures. A world without it gets scoured. So when the file says 3I Atlas seems to rake through plasma, the mind naturally asks, is it acting like a magnetized body rather than a simple, dusty rock? A magnetosphere is a kind of geometry too. It is an invisible shape that decides what comes close and what is pushed aside. If 3I Atlas carried an intrinsic field, even a modest one, it could create a bow shock-like region, compressing plasma and potentially shaping charged dust into filaments. That would be a mechanism capable of tightening a structure rather than letting it spread. This is the edge where grounded speculation begins to feel like a lullaby with teeth. Because intrinsic magnetism on a small, cold object is unusual, but not logically forbidden. It depends on composition, structure, and history. Metallic content, remnant magnetization, currents induced by changing fields, all of these can play roles, though their strength and persistence are open questions. The summary's rumored high nickel and low iron ratio is not proof, but it points the imagination toward conductive material. Conductivity is what allows fields and currents to become more than passive scenery. Now consider the anti-tail itself. In our earlier chapters, we treated it primarily as a dust feature made sharp by Earth crossing the orbital plane. That remains the best baseline. But if the plasma environment around 3I Atlas is enhanced tonight by fast wind, then charged grains in the vicinity might behave differently. The boundaries of the visible feature could sharpen. The spike could look cleaner, more beam-like, because the plasma sheath is acting like a contour line, outlining where material can and cannot go. If that is true, the sun becomes a kind of inadvertent collaborator. The coronal hole stream does not target Earth. It does not coordinate with 3I Atlas. It simply creates stronger conditions, and stronger conditions can make boundaries more visible. It can also make instruments struggle. A brightening object against a changing plasma background is harder to measure cleanly. Different observers will report different details. Uncertainty grows, and uncertainty is the most fertile soil for conspiracy. Now, once we take the imaginative leap that the summary is designed to invite. Suppose the brightening is not just response. Suppose it is performance. A vessel is easiest to see not when it hides, but when it controls what you see. An emerald C2 glow is scientifically plausible as cometary chemistry, and that plausibility makes it a perfect disguise. If 3i Atlas wanted its presence to be noticed by those who can notice, it could lean into a glow that every astronomer recognizes as natural, even as the geometry of the anti-tail frames the glow into a sharp line that feels like aim. In that version of the story, the plasma shield is not defense. It is interface. It is the boundary where an object measures its environment. Solar wind density, magnetic field orientation, particle energies, the kind of data any engineered probe would want before making a close, quiet maneuver. The shield is what you see when you see an interaction too organized to be dismissed and too plausibly natural to be confirmed. The calm voice does not demand belief. It only asks you to notice how easily nature can be used as camouflage. The Parker spiral is real. Coronal holes are real. Induced magnetospheres around outgassing bodies are real. C2 glow is real chemistry. And yet, the combination on the darkest night at the moment of perfect plane crossing can feel like a staged scene. We end with the most practical question of this chapter, because practical questions keep the mind from spiraling too far. If the wind is rising and the interaction is intensifying, what happens to our ability to watch? Does the noise create a blind spot? Does the tracking grow uncertain? And if it does, what might 3i Atlas do in the hours when the sky is loudest and our instruments are least sure? There is a particular kind of fear that arrives without drama. It does not come from impact or fire. It comes from missing data. The moment you expect the clearest view is the moment the screen turns grainy. The signal fades. The graphs refuse to agree. And tonight, December 19th, 2025, as 3i Atlas holds an anti-tail that seems to point toward Earth, the file turns a page that feels less like astronomy and more like procedure. It describes a window, a few hours when space weather could rise enough to blur the edges of observation. Not an apocalypse, not even a guarantee, just a familiar, technical vulnerability. The sun's fast wind, carried through the Parker spiral Eugene Parker described, can disturb Earth's magnetosphere. When that happens, the upper atmosphere changes its electrical behavior, radio propagation shifts, and systems that depend on clean electromagnetic conditions can become less reliable. In the ordinary world, this is routine. Satellite operators plan for geomagnetic storms. Radio amateurs notice unusual propagation. Power grids watch for induced currents. Space agencies publish alerts and indices. Nothing about it is secret. The universe does not care about our schedules. But the conspiracy lullaby is not built from secrets alone. It is built from the way routine can become cover. Because when the sky is noisy, you can always blame the noise. When tracking becomes inconsistent, you can always cite space weather. When an observation campaign misses a critical hour, you can always point to clouds, interference, or bad seeing. The blind spot does not need to be engineered. It only needs to be available. So we begin with what is likely. A coronal hole can drive a high-speed stream that reaches Earth and stirs geomagnetic activity. Increased geomagnetic activity can raise the background noise for certain measurements and can complicate the interpretation of faint signals. It can also change the density and structure of the upper atmosphere, affecting drag and orbit prediction for low Earth satellites. That does not mean we lose everything. It means the uncertainties widen, and wide uncertainties make small anomalies harder to distinguish from ordinary errors. Now bring in the anti-tail again. because the anti-tail is already an observational trap. It is a perspective effect that can look deliberate. Even if you photograph it, you are still photographing a line of sight through a dust plane, not a rigid rod in space. Small changes in observing geometry can produce large changes in appearance. If the solar wind also changes the plasma environment, the anti-tail can brighten, dim, sharpen, soften, and turn, all without any steering at all. This is how nature builds confusion. It stacks one ambiguity on top of another until the cleanest story becomes the hardest to defend. Geometry blurs intention, plasma blurs shape, and then space weather blurs the measurements. The file, of course, suggests another layer. It implies that the blind spot is not only a technical vulnerability, but a narrative vulnerability. They do not want us to see. In the strict sense, we do not have evidence for that claim, and we do not need it to understand why the claim is tempting. The claim is tempting because it converts the boring failure, a gap in observation, into a purposeful act. Humans prefer purposeful acts. They are easier to carry than randomness. So we treat the phrase, "they do not want us to see," as a psychological note, not a factual one. Then we ask the colder question that still belongs in science. What would you want to observe tonight if you suspected 3i Atlas might do something subtle? Not a collision, not a flash, something quiet. A change in trajectory beyond predicted uncertainties. A shift in brightness pattern beyond rotation and outgassing models. A sudden change in the anti-tail's coherence, its width, its brightness distribution. A spectral shift in the coma, perhaps in the green C2 emission, or in other faint lines that indicate changing composition or energy input. A drift in the 4-hour and 2-hour cadence, if that cadence is real. These are not dramatic signs. They are signatures you can hide inside a noisy background and still leave traces for those who know where to look. And this is where the thriller pacing tightens, even as the voice remains calm. Because the file's most unsettling suggestion is not that 3i Atlas is a weapon. It is that 3i Atlas might use a blind spot to perform a measurement. If you wanted to scan a planet's magnetosphere and atmosphere, you might choose a time when the magnetosphere is already disturbed. Not because you disturbed it, but because it is easier to read a system when it is responding. In laboratories, scientists probe materials by driving them and watching the response. In space, the driver can be solar wind. A high-speed stream presses on Earth's magnetic field, and the field flexes and rebounds. If 3i Atlas were watching, that flexing would reveal information about conductivity, density, field strength, and atmospheric coupling. It would be a natural diagnostic, and it would occur in a period when our own measurements are slightly less clean. That is the imaginative leap in its most plausible form. Exploitation, not orchestration. 3i Atlas does not need to cause the storm, it only needs to arrive during one. Now, we step back to the anchors, because anchors keep the story honest. Tonight is December 19th, 2025. Earth crosses the orbital plane of 3i Atlas, making an anti-tail visible by projection. Reports describe an emerald C2 glow. Summaries mention a 4-hour positional rhythm and a 2-hour brightness pulse. A coronal hole and fast solar wind, within the physics framework Eugene Parker helped define, can intensify plasma interaction and increase observational noise. None of this is impossible. All of it is common enough that a coincidence can feel like choreography. So the chapter ends not with a claim, but with an uncomfortable framing. If Three-Eye Atlas is only dust and ice, tonight's blind spot is simply the universe reminding us of our limits. But if Three-Eye Atlas is something that can use limits as cover, then the most important thing it does tonight could be the thing we fail to measure. Next, we open the file labeled structure. We move from wind and noise to material and signature. We look at the emerald glow again, at the rumored nickel-rich, iron-poor chemistry, and at the idea that what appears to be a wandering shard might carry the fingerprint of industry. Tonight, the file stops talking about direction and starts talking about substance. The anti-tail can be a trick of geometry, and the storm can be a trick of timing. Chemistry is harder to wave away. If Three-Eye Atlas carries an unusual recipe, it carries it no matter how we feel about the sky. Section 3 is where the story becomes quieter and more surgical. Imagine a cold laboratory, lights low, screens showing thin lines of color. Outside, the new moon keeps the darkness clean. Inside, we reduce Three-Eye Atlas to a spectrum, a barcode of light that tells us, imperfectly, what the object is made of and what is happening around it. The first anchor is familiar and almost soothing. Observers describe an emerald tint in the coma, consistent with diatomic carbon, C2, a molecule often seen in cometary comet when sunlight excites it. It is not exotic matter. It is ordinary chemistry, glowing in a way that can look supernatural when the rest of the sky is black. If C2 is present, it suggests carbon-bearing material being released and illuminated, which can happen in natural bodies that have been cold for a long time. The second anchor is the one that sharpens the mind. Summaries circulating with this event claim an unusually high nickel and unusually low iron ratio in the spectroscopic interpretation. On its face, that sounds like a violation of expectation, because iron is common in many solar system rocks, and nickel usually rides alongside it rather than towering above it. If the ratio truly leans nickel-rich, then the question becomes whether we are looking at a rare natural composition or at something shaped by selection. Spectroscopy is not a simple recipe card. It is inference. You look at light that has been absorbed or emitted, you match patterns to known lines, and you build a model that tries to explain what produced those patterns. Temperature matters. Ionization matters. The solar wind environment matters, especially tonight, when a fast stream may be changing the plasma around the object. If the coma is thin, lines can be faint. If the dust is thick, reflected sunlight can wash out details. And if the data are coming from different instruments, each with its own sensitivities, small mismatches can become large rumors. So before we let the words industrial signature sink in, we ask for natural paths that could mimic it. A natural body can be metal-rich. The solar system holds iron-nickel meteorites that are fragments of differentiated parent bodies, once molten, where metals sank toward the core. An interstellar object could, in principle, be a shard from a similarly differentiated world, a piece of a core, or a remnant of a collision that preferentially preserved metal. If that is true, then a nickel-heavy hint would be rare but not impossible. It would be an invitation to study, not an invitation to panic. There is also the possibility of misreading what is not actually in the light. Iron lines and nickel lines can overlap in complex ways depending on the conditions. Dust grains can carry both elements, while the observed gas phase is dominated by something else. A low iron signature might reflect that iron is locked in grains that are not producing strong emission features, while nickel in a particular chemical state is more visible. Even the phrase high nickel, low iron can be shorthand for a model fit rather than a direct measurement. In a night like this, shorthand travels faster than nuance, and yet the file keeps returning to the same unsettling idea. What if the ratio is real and stable? What if multiple observers, using different setups, keep landing on the same conclusion? That is where Avi Loeb's line of thinking becomes relevant, not as proof, but as a disciplined provocation. He has argued, in other contexts, that when an object's properties appear unusual, we should remain open to the possibility of artificial origin while demanding stronger evidence. The point is not to declare design. The point is to avoid refusing design as a hypothesis when the data do not politely fit the usual bins. If you let that hypothesis enter the room, even quietly, nickel becomes a different kind of symbol. Nickel-rich alloys are common in human engineering, where heat and stress matter. Some stainless steels and many high-temperature superalloys rely on nickel to maintain strength and resist corrosion. That is the industrial echo the summary wants you to hear because it pairs too neatly with the rest of the night. A coherent spike, a pulsing cadence, and a body that seems to hold its behavior under solar pressure. Michio Kaku's way of framing advanced capability is also useful here, again, as a plausibility anchor rather than a conclusion. A Type 1. Civilization, in his scale, harnesses the energy of its planet. Even at that level, long-range engineering would favor materials and architectures that tolerate radiation, temperature swings, and particle bombardment. If 3I Atlas were a relic of engineering, then a nickel-forward signature would not be a wild choice. It would be a conservative choice, a solution that prioritizes survival over elegance. Here is the imaginative leap, kept short and carefully labeled in your mind as a thought experiment. Imagine 3I Atlas not as a boulder, but as an old machine that has worn its outer layers away. Imagine that what we are sampling in the light is not the bulk composition of a rock, but the skin of a structure, a heat shield that has been ablated and is now shedding trace material into space. In that picture, the emerald Sigehu glow could still be real, not as fuel, but as residue, carbon compounds released from coatings or composites. The nickel-rich hint could be the fingerprint of an inner frame that has started to vent. Then we return to what we can say responsibly. A spectrum can mislead, and a single night can exaggerate. The solar wind can excite emission in ways that change line ratios. Viewing geometry can change how much reflected sunlight dominates over true emission. And the coma itself may be a mixture of gas and dust that varies on the same 2-hour and 4-hour rhythms described elsewhere in the file. If the brightness pulses are real, then the composition we infer can appear to pulse too, simply because we are sampling different parts of a changing environment. Still, even the skeptical reading leaves us with a real scientific mystery. Interstellar objects are rare opportunities. If 3I Atlas truly shows a stable compositional oddity, whether nickel-rich or otherwise, it would teach us about the diversity of planetary building blocks beyond our system. It could hint at differentiated bodies in other star systems, or at different chemical histories, or at processes we do not see often here. But the conspiracy lullaby asks its final question in a softer voice. If a natural explanation exists, why does 3I Atlas arrive with so many features that resemble strategy? A line that appears to point at Earth tonight, a cadence that resembles a heartbeat, a bright green glow that is both beautiful and distracting. and a rumored chemical fingerprint that sounds like metallurgy. If these are all coincidences, they are coincidences with sharp edges. In the next chapter, we look at the object's apparent wobble and ask whether tumbling can also be a kind of disguise. If you watch a distant object long enough, you begin to confuse its motion with its nature. A slow wobble becomes personality, a flicker becomes intent. Tonight, as 3-Eye Atlas keeps its anti-tail aligned in our sky's imagination, the file invites a different suspicion, that the object's apparent clumsiness may be a mask. Astronomers often describe small bodies as tumbling. Tumbling is what happens when an irregular object spins around more than one axis, like a book thrown into the air, never settling into a clean, simple rotation. Tumbling can be caused by collisions, outgassing jets, or tidal torques. It is common enough that it does not need a conspiracy. A natural interstellar fragment, battered by deep time, could easily arrive in our system spinning in a messy way. In fact, tumbling is the default if you want the universe to look honest. A controlled body looks controlled. A chaotic body looks natural. So if you are tempted to see 3-Eye Atlas as engineered, you should also expect it to try very hard to look unengineered, because camouflage in astronomy is not about invisibility. It is about plausibility. The hard science anchor here is simple. Light curves from rotating bodies can be complex. A tumbling object can produce multiple periodicities, harmonics, and drifting patterns. It can mimic the rumored cadence in the file, the 4-hour positional shift, and the 2-hour brightness pulse without any deliberate modulation. If the object is irregular, a brightness pulse can emerge whenever a reflective facet turns toward us, or whenever an active region rotates into sunlight and vents more material, brightening the coma. So the first thing we do is assume the wobble is real and natural. If the anti-tail is primarily a dust plane effect, then the object's tumbling is a separate behavior, affecting only the brightness pattern and the distribution of outgassing. In that reading, the story remains coherent without agency. Geometry makes the spike. Rotation makes the pulse. Space weather makes the noise. Chemistry gives the emerald C2 glow. Everything fits without requiring a mind behind it. But the summary introduces a sharper line, one that feels like a classified note scribbled in the margin. It suggests that while the exterior looks unstable, the center behaves as if it is stable. The phrase is vague, and we should treat it as such. Yet the idea behind it is clear enough to examine. Can an object appear to tumble while maintaining an internal orientation, or at least a stable functional axis? In engineering terms, yes. A spacecraft can spin-stabilize while still presenting an appearance of motion to an outside observer. A structure can rotate around a stable axis while deploying panels or releasing material in a way that makes the light curve look messy. Even more simply, a body could maintain a stable core orientation for a sensor while allowing its outer layers, dust, fragments, or venting structures to behave chaotically. If you only see the outer behavior, you might conclude the whole thing is drunk, while the instrument inside is perfectly sober. Now, we keep our feet on the floor. We cannot see inside 3-Eye Atlas. We do not have a probe there. We are reading distant light. The claim of stable core behavior is, at best, an interpretation from limited data. It could be a misunderstanding. It could be the result of fitting a model that assumes a stable axis. It could be a real hint. Or it could be a story fragment that survived translation and repetition because it sounds compelling. Still, the concept of a disguise algorithm is the kind of imaginative leap that belongs in mode HNCL, provided we treat it as hypothetical and keep returning to physical plausibility. Suppose 3i Atlas is an engineered artifact that has learned a simple rule: appear natural. In deep time, it would have passed many stars and many planets, and the easiest way to avoid attention would be to mimic the rotational irregularity of ordinary debris. A steady, clean spin might stand out. A messy tumble blends in. But tonight is not any night. Tonight, the geometry of the orbital plane crossing makes the anti-tail visible as a sharp feature. The new moon makes the sky darker. The fast solar wind adds noise and cover. In such a night, the disguise could serve two purposes at once. It could convince casual observers that the object is just a lumpy, comet-like shard, and it could also create predictable modulation in brightness and position, a rhythm that a more advanced listener might recognize as deliberate, while everyone else calls it tumbling. In this way, the disguise becomes a bridge between hard science and the unsettling question, because tumbling can produce rhythms. But if a rhythm is too stable, too consistent, too clean across nights and instruments, then the label tumbling becomes a convenient box to hide it in. People stop looking once they have a word. The anti-tail deepens that hiding place. If you are already telling the world the spike is a perspective effect, then the world will not look too closely at its coherence. It will not ask why the spike appears to behave like a beam. It will not ask why the beam seems to pulse. It will not ask whether the object's wobble is truly chaotic, or whether it is a choreography that only looks chaotic from far away. Now we return to the scientific anchors, because they are what make the lullaby plausible. An anti-tail can appear when Earth crosses the orbital plane. A coma can glow green with C2. A solar wind stream can intensify plasma interaction. A small body can tumble and produce complex light curves. That is all true enough to stand on. And yet, the file's deeper question remains. If 3i Atlas is natural, its tumbling is just the honest consequence of deep time. But if 3i Atlas is not natural, then tumbling is not a consequence. It is a performance. We end this chapter with one clean, unsettling thought, phrased as a question you can set beside your pillow without letting it cut. When you watch something far away and you see it wobble, are you watching chaos? Or are you watching a system that knows exactly how to look like chaos? Next, we turn to heat, because no disguise can hide thermodynamics forever. If the infrared hints that the core of 3i Atlas is warming even as the surface looks cold, then something may be changing beneath the skin, natural awakening or deliberate startup. A cold visitor can still carry a warm secret. Tonight, the most unsettling detail about 3i Atlas is not only the anti-tail that seems to point toward Earth, but the quiet suggestion that something inside may be warming. It is December 19th, 2025, and the sky is moonless. A perigee new moon close to Earth deepens the darkness and sharpens contrast, which is why the anti-tail looks so dramatic. The baseline explanation remains geometry. Earth is crossing the orbital plane of 3i Atlas, and a dust sheet laid along that orbit can collapse into a thin, sunward spike when seen edge on. Perspective can make a harmless structure feel like aim. Temperature is different from perspective. In astronomy, we estimate temperature through infrared light, the soft glow of heat that rises from a surface and from dense regions of dust. Interpreting that glow is delicate. A reflective surface can appear cooler than it truly is. A coma can add haze and confuse the model. Even so, infrared is one of the few tools that can hint at what is happening beneath the visible sheen. The simulated briefing tied to tonight frames a paradox. It suggests that while the outer appearance of 3I Atlas remains cold, infrared analysis hints that a deeper region closer to the nucleus is warming. Read that as a tentative interpretation, not a verdict. A distant object is often unresolved, and core can mean the warmest component a model favors, not a directly imaged center. Still, the idea matters because it introduces a new motive force, energy emerging from beneath the skin that looks quiet. There are natural ways to warm the inside while keeping the surface deceptively cold. Heat moves slowly through porous, dusty material, especially if the surface is coated in an insulating mantle. Sunlight can warm a shallow layer first, and the energy can migrate inward in a delayed wave. If the surface is reflective, it can shed heat efficiently back to space, while pockets just beneath it retain warmth. This is how a body can look calm at the surface while internal changes are already underway. A second natural mechanism is phase change, the slow chemistry of ice. Some cometary ices can exist in an amorphous state at very low temperatures, trapping gases in their structure like breath in frozen glass. When warmed past a threshold, that ice can crystallize and release heat, a quiet exothermic step that can trigger further warming and help trapped volatiles escape. Bursts of gas can loft fresh dust and molecules into the coma. Under sunlight, carbon-bearing fragments can produce diatomic carbon, C2, which fluoresces green and gives the coma an emerald glow. Now add the environment. The space around Earth is not empty tonight. The solar wind, shaped into the Parker spiral that Eugene Parker described, continues to flow outward, and a fast stream associated with a coronal hole can change plasma conditions along 3I Atlas's path. That can alter how quickly gases ionize and how bright certain emissions appear. It can also complicate temperature inference, because charged dust and plasma interactions can add faint components that resemble thermal brightness. In other words, a brighter coma can look like extra heat in the numbers even when the nucleus is only modestly warmer. This is where the reported rhythms begin to feel relevant to thermodynamics. A 2-hour brightness pulse could be ordinary venting, a cycle where pressure builds beneath a crust, cracks, releases gas and dust, then seals again as the local surface cools or refreezes. A 4-hour positional shift, if it is real, could reflect repeating nudges from asymmetric outgassing, tiny reaction impulses that slightly shift the center of light we measure. A warming interior makes both patterns more plausible without invoking an artificial engine. But the briefing also insists on a chemical detail that keeps tugging at the imagination. A high nickel and low iron balance presented as unusual. Spectral inference is messy, and these ratios must be treated carefully, yet the thought is hard to ignore. Nickel-rich material conducts heat efficiently, spreading energy through a structure in ways that can reduce obvious hotspots on the surface. In purely natural terms, it could be a metal-rich shard from a differentiated body, rare but possible. In Avi Loeb's style of reasoning, an unusual material balance is not proof, but it is a reason to keep the industrial alloy hypothesis on the table until better constraints arrive. And in Michio Kaku's Type 1 framing, advanced materials are not magic. They are engineering made patient and practical. Here is the controlled imaginative leap, offered as a thought experiment and nothing more. Suppose 3i Atlas is not merely warming because sunlight is finally reaching a stubborn pocket of ice. Suppose it is waking after a long dormancy. A system built to sleep would wake in stages: a faint internal temperature rise, a periodic pulse as power cycles stabilize, then a gradual adjustment of orientation. In that scenario, the anti-tail that seems to point at Earth tonight becomes a perfect disguise because everyone expects the spike to be perspective and outgassing, and expectation makes camouflage easy. Then we return to discipline, because discipline is what keeps this story safe to listen to at night. Infrared interpretations can be fragile. A warm core can be an artifact of resolution, background subtraction, or assumptions about emissivity. A cold surface can look colder if it reflects sunlight efficiently, and a small warm region can dominate a model if the object is unresolved and surrounded by a changing coma. The safest statement tonight is that the thermal picture is intriguing and uncertain. Uncertainty is not evidence, but it is a place where stories grow. Still, one question belongs here, whispered rather than declared. If 3i Atlas truly shows signs of internal warming while presenting a cold exterior, what is driving the change? Is it delayed conduction and crystallizing ice? Is it the solar wind and plasma environment brightening the coma and confusing the infrared story? Or is it the first step of a dormant system returning, choosing this new moon plane crossing as cover for its awakening? In the next section, the pacing will soften toward relief, toward the possibility that the anti-tail is not a gun, but a scanner, and that the encounter is a passage rather than a strike. By now, the meat has built a silhouette. A narrow anti-tail that seems to point at Earth, a stormy solar wind that threatens a blind spot, a rumored rhythm, 4 hours like a heartbeat, 2 hours like a pulse, a green C2 glow, emerald and calm in color, unsettling in implication, and a whisper of nickel-rich chemistry that sounds, in the wrong light, like metallurgy. Tonight is still December 19th, 2025. The moon remains hidden, and the darkness keeps its quiet. If this were a thriller told in a louder voice, the next page would be impact. It would be fire and alarms. But the universe does not need to shout to be strange, and it does not always choose the simplest dramatic ending. Sometimes it chooses the most unnerving ending of all. Nothing happens, nothing you can point to and call catastrophe. Only a quiet passage that leaves you wondering what you missed. The first relief is the most physical one. There is no collision. 3i Atlas is not on a path to strike Earth tonight. The anti-tail, as sharp as it looks, is not a spear traveling toward us through space. It is a line of sight through a dust structure made apparent by geometry. Earth is crossing the orbital plane of 3i Atlas, and that crossing can make a dust trail appear to point sunward, straight toward the observer. The physics remains ordinary, even when the perception feels personal. This is the moment where the file, if it is honest, must allow the listener to exhale. Most of the fear comes from misunderstanding what a tail is. A tail is not an arm that reaches. It is a wake, a trace, a map of how light and plasma sculpt material. Even an anti-tail is not a thrust. It is projection. It is the collapse of a wide sheet into a thin line because you are looking through the sheet edge on. It points at you the way a hallway points at you when you stand at one end. The hallway is not moving. You are simply aligned with it. But relief is not the end of a conspiracy lullaby. It is the transition to a quieter kind of unease. If the anti-tail is not a weapon, then what is it? The summary suggests a gentler but stranger possibility, that the anti-tail is more like a scanner. In science, scanning is not science fiction. It is measurement. You send energy or you sample reflected energy, and you infer shape, composition, density. In the most grounded sense, the sun is doing the scanning already. Sunlight hits 3i atlas, and we read the reflected spectrum. Solar wind hits the coma, and we read the plasma interaction through emissions and disturbances. The universe scans itself, constantly, with fields and photons. So when the file says, not a gun, a scanner, we can interpret it in two ways. The first is purely natural. The anti-tail becomes a scanner for us because it reveals the dust plane and the distribution of grains along the orbit. It lets astronomers infer particle sizes, density, and the history of ejection. It is a diagnostic feature, a tool we did not build, but can use. The second interpretation is the one that belongs to mode HNCL, and we handle it carefully. Suppose the anti-tail is not only a diagnostic for us. Suppose it is a diagnostic for 3i Atlas, not because it fires a beam, but because it chooses how to present its environment to itself. A coherent structure aligned along the orbital plane could be a way to measure how the observer, Earth, behaves under certain conditions. If the object is watching, it does not need a flashlight. It needs contrast. It needs timing. It needs the night to be dark enough that small changes in brightness and geometry stand out. The rumored rhythms return here in a softer form. A 4-hour positional shift could be rotational behavior or sampling artifact. A 2-hour pulse could be outgassing or changing scattering. But if you choose to let the thought experiment live, for one more paragraph, the pulses could also be a probing cadence. Not language, not threat, just repetition designed to see whether anything responds. Do the satellites adjust? Do the radars change modes? Do the observers change exposure? In that sense, the handshake is not a greeting. It is a measurement of capability. And yet the most important soothing fact remains. Even if 3i Atlas were an engineered probe, it would have no reason to collide. Collision destroys information. A scanner, by definition, prefers proximity without contact. A silent passage is more valuable than an explosion. It allows the object to gather what it wants and leave without leaving debris that screams its intentions. So the story shifts. The thriller energy drains, not into emptiness, but into a quieter tension. The idea that something can pass close enough to be meaningful and still leave no obvious mark. That is why the new moon matters psychologically. Darkness feels like vulnerability, but darkness is also privacy. The sky can be dark for us and still bright for instruments. What feels like blindness to the human eye may be clarity to an object that has been building its sensors for longer than we have been building our history. We do not claim that is happening. We only acknowledge that the night allows the thought. Then we return to what we can say calmly. The anti-tail is best explained by Earth crossing the orbital plane of 3i Atlas. The green glow can be explained by C2 chemistry under solar excitation. Space weather can explain noise and observational uncertainty. The rest, nickel ratios, rhythms, and scanning, are hypotheses layered on top of ambiguous data. And now, because this section is designed to begin the wind down, we let the fear soften into imagery that is almost tender. Imagine 3-Eye Atlas not as a threat, but as a passerby that turns its lantern slightly as it goes by, noticing the outline of our atmosphere, the shimmer of our magnetosphere, the thin shell where life has learned to cling. A passerby can notice you without touching you. That is not comfort exactly, but it is relief. In the next chapter, we slow further. We treat gravity not as an enemy, but as a lullaby. We imagine the planet responding, not with panic, but with small, gentle shifts, tides and winds. The kind of changes that happen all the time, made meaningful only because we are thinking about them tonight. Now the night begins to soften. The sharp words from earlier pages, spike, storm, scar, begin to lose their grip. Nothing has struck us, nothing has announced itself with fire, and yet the encounter still feels real, because even a silent passage can be felt in the body of a planet. Gravity is the quietest force in this story. It does not flash green like C2. It does not roar like solar wind. It simply exists, a gentle constant that decides how oceans rise, how air circulates, how your own breath falls into rhythm. If 3-Eye Atlas is passing through our neighborhood tonight, then gravity is the one interaction we can be sure of, even if it is small. For most interstellar passers-by, the gravitational effect on Earth is negligible, a whisper lost in the much louder pull of the moon and the sun. The moon, even hidden in a new moon phase, still tugs at the oceans and the crust, and perigee only makes that tug slightly more noticeable in the numbers. The sun, vast and constant, shapes the tides as well. Against those giants, a distant object like 3-Eye Atlas is unlikely to move the sea in any dramatic way. The safe assumption is that you will not feel it, and the world will not react in any visible, immediate fashion. But for a lullaby, we do not need drama, we only need permission to imagine the subtle. Picture Earth as a sleeping animal, massive and warm, curled under a thin blanket of atmosphere. The blanket is constantly shifting, winds moving like slow breath, clouds forming and dissolving. The oceans are darker than the land at night, a moving skin that reflects faint starlight and the glow of distant cities. Gravity is the hand that keeps that skin from flying away into the void. Tonight, as the anti-tail of 3-Eye Atlas appears to point toward us, we can reframe the image, not as a spear, but as a line passing near the edge of a great sphere. The object does not need to touch us to create a relationship. Even distant gravity is a relationship. It is the universe's way of saying that everything has influence, even in silence. If 3-Eye Atlas is small, its gravitational tug is tiny. If it is larger, the tug could be slightly less tiny. Either way, it becomes a useful thought. The pull is gentle, a pressure so light it cannot compete with the moon's familiar rhythm. But because you are thinking about it, because your mind is watching the sky, the gentle becomes meaningful. The planet is always being stroked by gravity, from passing bodies, from asteroids you never hear about, from distant alignments you never notice. You only rarely get a story that makes you listen to that stroking. This is where the earlier scanner idea changes shape. In the thriller chapters, scanning sounded like surveillance. Now, scanning can be understood as sensitivity. A passing object, natural or engineered, moves through Earth's gravitational well, That well has a shape. It can be mapped. It can be felt. If 3i Atlas were measuring anything tonight, it could be measuring the curve of our gravity, the way our mass is distributed, the way our planet's density differs between ocean basins and continental roots. For humans, those differences are studied with satellites and long mathematics. For a traveler, the differences are simply the feel of the path. If you allow the thought experiment again, only for a moment, you can imagine 3i Atlas listening to Earth the way a seismograph listens to a distant quake, not by hearing sound, but by sensing tiny shifts in trajectory, tiny changes in the local field. Gravity becomes a conversation without words. And unlike the anti-tale, gravity is not a trick of perspective. It is real, even if it is small. The solar wind is still flowing tonight, still following the Parker spiral pattern. If the coronal hole stream has been disturbing Earth's magnetosphere, then the upper atmosphere may be shifting slightly, swelling, and relaxing in response. Those changes are not caused by 3i Atlas, but they add to the feeling that the planet is being touched. Between plasma and gravity, the world becomes a responsive thing rather than a static stage. And then there is your own nervous system, which is also an instrument. It notices patterns. It looks for faces in shadows. It hears intent in repetition. Earlier, the file leaned on the 4-hour and 2-hour rhythms, the alleged heartbeat. Tonight, you can let those numbers become sleep-friendly instead of alarming. 4 hours is half a night. 2 hours is a gentle cycle. Your own sleep moves through patterns too. The body rises and falls through stages, repeating in a way that is beautiful and not suspicious. Not every rhythm is a code. Sometimes a rhythm is simply the way matter moves when it is allowed to be itself. So we begin to drift away from the sharpness. The anti-tail remains, but it becomes a line of dust that happens to be aligned with us, a corridor of memory along an orbit. The emerald C2 glow remains, but it becomes chemistry, a little carbon singing in sunlight. The solar wind remains, but it becomes space weather, the sun's breath moving through its spiral pathways. And 3i Atlas remains what it most truly is in this moment, a traveler passing through, close enough to be interesting, far enough to leave us intact. If you are listening in bed, you can let your attention do what the oceans do. Rise a little, fall a little. Let the thought of gravity, always present, always gentle, be the rhythm you borrow. Let the fear become curiosity, and then let curiosity become softness. In the final chapter, we will let the object recede. We will widen the view until 3i Atlas becomes small again, until the anti-tail fades into the background, until the night returns to being only a night. And we will end the file the way a sleep documentary should, with the sense that the universe is vast and strange, and yet, tonight, it has chosen to pass without harm. By the time you reach the end of a night like this, the mind has changed. Earlier, the anti-tail of 3i Atlas felt like a finger aimed at Earth. Now it feels more like a line that happened to cross our sight, a quiet geometry that became dramatic only because the sky was dark enough to make it sharp. It is still December 19th, 2025. The moon remains hidden in its new moon phase, close to Earth, and the darkness stays deep and clean. If you have been following the story from the beginning, you have carried several layers at once: hard science, grounded speculation, and one or two carefully controlled imaginative leaps. Now, as the traveler recedes, We let those layers settle into something softer. We began with the simplest anchor. Earth crossed the orbital plane of 3i Atlas tonight, and that crossing can make a dust feature appear to point sunward, even toward the observer. Anti-tails are real and have startled people before. Perspective can create a spear from a sheet, the way a hallway becomes a line when you stand at one end. Then we added the night's other anchors. Observers described an emerald tint consistent with diatomic carbon, C2, glowing in the coma. Space weather, shaped by the physics Eugene Parker helped formalize, carried solar wind through the Parker spiral and may have increased noise and uncertainty at the very moment attention was highest. And the file carried its stranger whispers. A rumored 4-hour positional shift, a 2-hour brightness pulse, and an unusual high-nickel, low-iron story that, if true, would push our imagination toward industrial alloys and Michio Kaku's language of capability. In a strict scientific sense, each of those whispers can still belong to nature. A tumbling body can pulse in brightness. Sampling can manufacture periodicity. Spectra can be misread. Nickel-rich compositions can occur in rare metal-dominated fragments. Plasma interactions can sharpen and brighten comet without any internal engine. The calm mind holds these options and does not rush. And yet, the reason a conspiracy lullaby works is not that it proves the dark option. It is that it shows how the dark option can hide inside the bright, ordinary one. Nature provides cover. Geometry provides plausibility. Space weather provides noise. And in that cover, the mind can imagine a traveler that measures without touching, that scans without speaking, that uses coincidence the way a skilled magician uses misdirection. Now, the traveler becomes smaller. In the first hours, the anti-tail felt like the main character. But anti-tails depend on alignment, and alignment does not last. As Earth continues along its path, the viewing geometry shifts, and the thin corridor of dust loses its edge. The spike softens. Its sharpness dissolves back into the background. The line stops feeling like a pointer and starts looking like what it always was, a trace, a wake, a reminder that dust can linger along an orbit like a faint scar in space. As 3i Atlas drifts onward, you can imagine its brightness fading in a way that is almost kind. Not because it is choosing kindness, but because distance always does this. Distance turns intensity into memory. A bright point becomes a dim point. A dim point becomes a point you have to look for. And then, one evening, you realize you have forgotten to check. If the rumored heartbeat was real, 4 hours and 2 hours, it will also weaken into the noise as the signal fades. The world returns to its own rhythms. The tides keep their familiar cycles, mostly ruled by the moon and the sun. The magnetosphere continues to flex under the solar wind. The atmosphere continues to breathe. Human systems continue their scheduled routines. The possible handshake, if there ever was one, becomes indistinguishable from ordinary variability. This is the gentle relief at the center of the wind down. The universe can approach and still leave you intact. It can brush the edge of your attention and then move on. Even in a story designed to hold a little fear, the ending can be comforting because the most important physical fact has remained true all night. Nothing has collided. Nothing has shattered the planet. Nothing has forced you to be more than an observer. So we widen the view now, the way a camera in a documentary pulls back until the subject is a small point against a vast field. The solar system becomes a quiet neighborhood of moving lights. The sun, bright and restless, continues to breathe its spiral wind outward. Earth continues to spin, carrying your room through darkness into morning. And Three-Eye Atlas continues to travel, as it has traveled for a very long time, heading toward distances so large that our language loses confidence. And now the last few minutes are not about proof or verdict. They are about the feeling of scale. In the darkest version of the story, Three-Eye Atlas noticed Earth tonight and chose silence. It passed close enough to measure, to record, to learn, and then it turned away without leaving a message we could recognize. That thought can feel unsettling, but notice the softness inside it. Silence is not impact. Silence is not harm. Silence can be indifference, or restraint, or simply the limit of what we can detect. In the most grounded version of the story, Three-Eye Atlas is a natural interstellar body, and tonight's anti-tail was a perfect illusion born from orbital plane geometry under a new moon sky. The green glow was chemistry. The rhythms were rotation and sampling. The storm was solar weather. In that story, the universe is still mysterious, but the mystery is the mystery of complexity, not intention. Either way, you are safe in this moment. The sky is large, and your room is small, and both belong to the same quiet physics. Your body is a warm island under a thin atmosphere, and that atmosphere has held all night. Your breath is steady. Your thoughts can slow. Let the image of Three-Eye Atlas drifting away become a cue for your own mind to drift. Let the anti-tail fade in your imagination the way a line fades on a chalkboard after the lesson ends. Let the emerald glow dim until it is only a memory of color. Let the questions remain unanswered without demanding that they resolve tonight. Because this is the gift of a universe that does not explain itself on schedule. It allows you to rest. It allows you to be curious without being chased. It allows a traveler to pass and leave you with nothing more dangerous than wonder. And now, as the last edge of the story recedes into dark space, you can do the simplest thing an observer can do. You can close your eyes and let the vastness hold you gently. You can sleep, not because the universe is simple, but because even its mysteries move on quietly into the void. Good night.